When someone expects you to chase after them, silence can completely change the dynamic. Not angry silence, not silence meant to punish. The quiet that comes after you finally decide to protect your own peace instead of constantly proving your love. It happens when someone pulls away expecting emotional messages, repeated phone calls, long explanations, and endless reassurance, only to discover that none of it arrives. Your screen stays quiet. There are no dramatic speeches, no desperate attempts to change their mind, no emotional bargaining, just space. Stay with me, because this is where the story often takes an unexpected turn. Many people know how to respond to conflict, but they are far less prepared for calm distance. When someone can no longer predict your reactions, the entire emotional pattern begins to change. That uncertainty often creates more reflection than any argument ever could. Silence removes the familiar script, leaving both people alone with their own thoughts instead of each other's emotions. If you have ever cared deeply about someone, felt pushed away, and finally reached the point where you stopped chasing and started choosing your own well-being, you are not alone. Many people discover that stepping back feels uncomfortable at first because it breaks habits that have existed for a long time. When someone has grown used to your constant availability, your quiet presence can feel unfamiliar. That does not automatically mean they are panicking or preparing to return. Everyone responds differently. Some appreciate the space, some begin reflecting, others continue living exactly as they did before. What matters is not predicting another person's response, but recognizing what your silence represents. It is no longer an attempt to convince someone to stay. It is an act of self-respect. That shift changes your own emotional foundation, regardless of what another person chooses to do. Instead of measuring your value through their attention, you begin measuring it through the peace you are creating for yourself. And that is where real healing quietly begins. Many emotionally guarded people experience an internal conflict they rarely explain openly. On one hand, closeness can feel overwhelming because vulnerability requires trust. On the other hand, complete separation can create its own discomfort because meaningful connections still matter. Those two fears can exist at the same time, creating confusing behavior that seems contradictory from the outside. Someone may pull away while secretly hoping the relationship remains available. They may seek distance without wanting permanent loss. That pattern often continues as long as both people keep playing familiar roles. But when one person calmly steps out of that cycle, something important changes. The emotional routine no longer works the same way. The predictable responses disappear. That uncertainty can encourage reflection because the usual expectations are no longer being met. Reflection, however, is not the same as transformation. Genuine growth is revealed through consistent communication, accountability, and reliable actions over time. Those qualities matter far more than temporary emotional reactions or imagined scenarios. At first, silence may simply feel like relief. Without difficult conversations or emotional tension, daily life appears calmer. Many people naturally fill that extra space with work, hobbies, routines, or other distractions. But as time passes, familiar memories often begin returning unexpectedly. A conversation comes back to mind. A meaningful place feels different. A routine suddenly reminds them of someone who is no longer there. That happens because distance often gives people a clearer perspective than constant interaction ever could. Reflection grows during quiet moments. They may begin wondering how things could have been different, or whether important opportunities were overlooked. Those questions are part of normal human experience. What happens next depends entirely on the choices they make afterward. If someone truly values rebuilding a relationship, they will eventually show it through actions that are steady, respectful, and consistent. Until then, your silence continues serving its real purpose. It is not about making someone miss you. It is about giving yourself the freedom to stop chasing certainty and start trusting your own worth. And once you reach that place, whether someone returns or not, you have already gained something far more valuable than reassurance. You have gained peace. As time passes, the distance can begin feeling different. At first, space often seems comfortable because there are fewer difficult conversations, fewer emotional demands, and fewer moments that require vulnerability. But eventually the quiet becomes harder to ignore. Without constant interaction, there is nothing left to distract someone from their own thoughts. No ongoing arguments, no emotional tension, no immediate problem to solve, just time, reflection, and whatever feelings have been sitting beneath the surface all along. Stay with me, because this is where many people discover something unexpected. Silence does not automatically change another person, but it often changes the environment in which they experience their own emotions. When the usual cycle disappears, people are left with themselves. Sometimes that becomes the beginning of honest self-reflection. Sometimes it simply confirms the path they were already choosing. Either way, silence often reveals more than constant conversation ever could. One of the biggest changes happens in perception. When someone grows accustomed to your constant availability, they may unconsciously assume your support will always be there. But when you quietly step back, without anger or drama, the picture changes. Your calmness begins to communicate something words never could. It shows that your self-respect has become stronger than your fear of losing the relationship. That quiet confidence often leaves a deeper impression than emotional pursuit. It reminds both people that love is meaningful only when it is freely shared, not endlessly chased. If someone begins realizing that you are no longer waiting in the same place emotionally, they may start viewing the relationship from a different perspective. They may wonder whether they overlooked something valuable. They may begin asking themselves questions they avoided while everything still felt familiar. Reflection often arrives in small moments rather than dramatic breakthroughs. A familiar song, a shared memory, a place that suddenly feels different. Little by little, those experiences invite a person to look back with greater honesty than before. Many emotionally guarded people find it easier to suppress uncomfortable feelings while a relationship is active, because they are focused on managing the immediate situation. Once distance enters the picture, however, those distractions become less effective. Quiet evenings create room for memories. Familiar routines bring back forgotten emotions. Without constant interaction, people sometimes notice how much another person's steady presence had become part of their daily life. That realization can feel surprising, because emotional security often goes unnoticed until it is no longer there. Still, it is important to remember that recognizing someone's value is only the first step. Real transformation requires more than private reflection. It requires visible change, honest communication, accountability, consistent effort over time. Those actions matter far more than temporary emotional intensity. A meaningful relationship is rebuilt through reliable choices, not simply through strong feelings that remain hidden. At the same time, an internal conflict can begin developing. Part of someone may want to protect themselves by maintaining distance, while another part quietly misses the connection they once had. Those opposing emotions can create uncertainty. They may think about reaching out, then hesitate. They may remember meaningful moments while still feeling unsure how to respond. That hesitation is a normal part of emotional conflict, but uncertainty alone does not determine the future. What ultimately matters is the direction someone chooses afterward. Do they remain silent forever, or do they move toward greater honesty and emotional responsibility? Those decisions become visible through actions, not assumptions. Meanwhile, your own journey continues. Every day you choose peace over endless chasing, you strengthen your confidence. Every boundary you honor reminds you that healthy love is built on mutual effort, rather than one person carrying the emotional weight alone. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson silence can teach. Its real purpose is not to make someone miss you. Its purpose is to help you rediscover yourself. From that place of clarity, whether someone returns or not, you no longer depend on uncertainty for your happiness. You move forward with greater wisdom, stronger boundaries, and the quiet confidence that genuine connection never requires you to abandon your own peace. And avoidants are no exception. The difference is that they usually recognize the value of emotional safety only after it disappears. So now, they begin noticing the silence in ordinary moments. Nobody checking on them the way you did. Nobody noticing the small changes in their mood. Nobody emotionally reaching toward them with patience and familiarity. And this is where many avoidants begin replaying the relationship differently in their minds. While the relationship was active, their focus may have stayed locked onto pressure, expectations, vulnerability, or the fear of losing their independence. But after silence settles in, the brain often starts filtering memories through loss instead of fear. Suddenly they remember your softness more vividly, your effort, your understanding, the way you stayed emotionally present even when they struggled to reciprocate consistently. And the painful part is realizing, too late, how emotionally rare that actually was. That replaying process becomes almost obsessive in quiet moments. Old conversations start sounding different in hindsight. Things they dismissed emotionally before now hit them with delayed meaning. Maybe they remember moments when you tried to communicate calmly while they withdrew. Moments when you offered reassurance while secretly needing reassurance yourself. Moments when your patience was mistaken for emotional weakness instead of emotional maturity. And because avoidants struggle to process emotions in real time, they often do not fully understand the emotional significance of a relationship until distance creates clarity. That is why silence becomes so psychologically intense for them. It removes emotional overstimulation and leaves them alone with reflection. And reflection can become unbearable when someone starts realizing they may have pushed away the very person who loved them most consistently. But instead of openly admitting this realization, many avoidants begin testing emotional access carefully. Small actions, indirect signals, maybe a random reaction to one of your stories after weeks of silence, a casual check-in that feels emotionally colder than what they are actually feeling inside, a message disguised as friendliness when it is really anxiety underneath, because they are trying to answer one terrifying question without directly asking it. Do I still have access to you? And this is where your continued silence, or even your calmness, starts transforming the entire dynamic. Because if you respond differently now, if your energy feels lighter, calmer, less emotionally desperate, the avoidant immediately notices it. They may not say it out loud, but they feel the shift deeply. The person who once over-explained, overgave, and overreached emotionally is no longer operating from a fear of loss. And that changes everything psychologically, because avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional pressure, but they are also deeply affected by emotional absence when genuine attachment exists underneath. Your calmness communicates something powerful without saying a single word. You are no longer abandoning yourself to keep them comfortable. And for many avoidants, this becomes the moment real panic quietly begins forming beneath the surface. Not because you yelled, not because you demanded closure, but because your silence forced them to confront the possibility that you are emotionally moving forward without needing their validation anymore. And that possibility feels far more threatening than any argument ever could. Because underneath the calm exterior avoidants try so hard to maintain, silence has now started activating emotions they buried for years, sometimes even long before you ever entered their life. That is the deeper reason your silence affects them so intensely. It is not just about missing you. It is about finally losing the distractions that help them avoid themselves. When relationships are active, avoidance can focus on external things. The pressure, the expectations, the fear of opening up, and the constant need for distance all seem manageable while the connection is still active. But once the relationship grows quiet and your emotional chasing comes to a complete stop, they are left facing something they have avoided for a very long time: their own thoughts. For someone who has spent years protecting themselves by pushing feelings aside, that inner experience can become incredibly intense. Emotions that stayed locked away for so long begin rising to the surface one after another. Regret, longing, fear, nostalgia, shame, unexpected emotional dependence, a level of vulnerability they spent years believing they could live without. Your silence becomes the space where those emotions finally become impossible to ignore. Stay with me, because this is where everything begins to change. This explains why they may appear calm or unaffected at first, only to struggle much later. Their emotional process usually follows a different timeline. Self-protection comes first. Honest reflection comes afterward. By the time they truly understand the value of what slipped away, the other person has often already started healing and rebuilding life. Then something deeply emotional begins happening inside them. They start looking back at the relationship through a completely different lens, seeing things they never fully appreciated while they still had them. Small memories suddenly carry enormous emotional weight. The way you checked on them without expecting anything in return, the patience you showed when they became distant or emotionally unavailable, the quiet comfort of simply sitting beside each other during ordinary days that once felt insignificant. People often overlook emotional safety while living inside it, because familiar experiences can easily feel permanent. Those who struggle with closeness are especially vulnerable to this pattern, because their fear of intimacy keeps pulling attention away from the very connection they secretly wanted. Now that you are gone, the memories begin changing. The sharp edges soften. Their mind slowly stops replaying only the fears and starts remembering the warmth, the peace, and the stability they once experienced. That shift becomes difficult because it forces them to admit how deeply attached they actually became beneath the distance they kept creating. Suddenly your laugh appears in their thoughts without warning. Old conversations they once ignored become meaningful. Songs, familiar places, daily routines, and tiny details connected to you begin bringing back emotions they thought had disappeared. Don't skip this part, because this quiet reflection often changes everything. Without new interactions distracting them, every memory becomes louder, and every feeling becomes harder to escape. This is usually the point where they begin realizing that your love was never the burden they convinced themselves it was. Instead, it may have been one of the healthiest and most emotionally secure experiences they had ever known. Then comes the realization they fear more than anything else, the possibility that you are truly moving forward, not pretending, not slowly waiting in the background, actually moving on with your life. This awareness often arrives all at once instead of little by little. Maybe they notice your energy feels calmer during a rare conversation. Maybe your voice carries less emotional attachment than before. Maybe they simply sense that your world no longer revolves around them. For the first time, they are not reacting to your efforts to reconnect. They are reacting to the possibility that your absence is becoming permanent. That quiet realization often sparks emotional panic beneath the surface, because many people who avoid closeness secretly assume the connection will always remain available. They expect distance to pause the relationship, not end it. But when they finally feel that emotional door beginning to close for real, the fear of losing someone becomes stronger than the fear of letting someone in. The person who once pulled away now finds themselves frightened by the thought of never getting another chance. Their emotions begin clashing with the identity they built around independence and control. One part still wants space, another part desperately hopes they have not lost you forever. That conflict creates emotional confusion they rarely know how to explain. And what happens next may surprise you, because this inner struggle often becomes the turning point they never expected. This is why they often come back in ways that feel emotionally confusing instead of openly vulnerable. Rather than making a dramatic confession, they may reach out quietly, cautiously, almost as if nothing important happened. A simple message, a casual question, a small reaction to something you posted. On the surface, it seems ordinary, but underneath it often carries emotions they are struggling to express. These small attempts are usually meant to test whether warmth still exists between you, without exposing themselves to the risk of rejection. Speaking directly about the relationship still feels too overwhelming, so they move carefully instead. Hidden beneath those small actions is often fear. Fear that they waited too long. Fear that your silence has changed you forever. Fear that you no longer need them emotionally the way you once did. But here's something many people misunderstand. Not every return is a sign of personal growth. Some people come back simply because loneliness becomes uncomfortable. Others return because they miss the comfort, familiarity, attention, or emotional safety they once received. But there are also those who come back because the silence forced them to face themselves honestly for the very first time. Those situations are completely different. One person is trying to escape emotional pain. The other is trying to become someone who no longer repeats the same cycle. One wants the comfort back without changing anything. The other begins realizing that their old behavior was the real problem. Stay with me, because this difference matters more than most people realize. The real difference becomes visible over time, not through promises but through actions. It shows up in accountability, in consistency, in emotional honesty. It becomes clear when someone is finally willing to stay present, even after vulnerability returns, instead of pulling away the moment the connection starts feeling real again. That is why silence is so powerful. It does not force anyone to change. It does not manipulate feelings or create emotions that never existed. It simply removes the constant emotional noise that once allowed them to avoid looking inward. Once the distractions disappear, they are left alone with their own thoughts, their own choices, and the emotional consequences that naturally follow. Instead of someone repeatedly explaining what went wrong, life begins teaching those lessons without words. Nobody talked them into missing you. Nobody convinced them that your presence mattered. Your absence allowed reality to speak for itself. That kind of realization often reaches much deeper than any argument ever could. As time passes, they may begin comparing new interactions with the connection they once shared with you. Surface-level conversations may suddenly feel empty. Casual relationships may seem emotionally flat. They begin remembering the safety, understanding, and depth they once experienced. This is important because many people assume they simply do not feel deeply. In reality, many of them experience emotions very intensely. The challenge is not a lack of feeling. The challenge is the fear of depending on someone, the fear of being emotionally exposed, and the fear of losing control once genuine closeness develops. Don't skip this part because this shift explains so much. Silence removes the immediate fear of intimacy and replaces it with something far more difficult to ignore, the possibility of permanent loss. Sometimes that is the first moment they finally see the relationship without the walls they built around themselves. While all of this may be happening inside them, something equally meaningful begins happening inside you. This part is often forgotten because most conversations focus only on whether they miss you, regret their choices, or eventually return. But silence transforms the person who chooses it just as much as the one left behind by it. At first, staying silent may have felt almost impossible. Every part of you probably wanted to send one more message, explain your heart one more time, ask if they ever truly cared, search for answers, fight for reassurance, fight for one last chance to save the relationship. Your silence did not mean your love disappeared overnight. It meant that constantly carrying the emotional weight of the connection had slowly started breaking your own sense of peace. In the beginning, that silence hurts because it takes away your usual way of coping. There are no more constant phone checks, no more analyzing every delayed reply, no more trying to understand mixed signals or searching for hidden meanings. It becomes just you, your emotions, your grief, and the empty space you tried so hard to fill. But little by little, something unexpected begins happening. The same silence that encouraged their reflection also begins rebuilding your own life from within. You start realizing how much energy you spent trying to hold everything together by yourself. You begin seeing how often you ignored your own emotional needs simply to stay connected with someone who struggled to meet you halfway. The hardest realization is understanding that love itself was never the problem. You loved deeply. You cared sincerely. What truly mattered was whether both people were willing to grow in the same direction. And that final realization often becomes the beginning of your greatest emotional freedom.